What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham Jason Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking the latest episode of Broken Skull Sessions with none other than Bret the Hitman Hart right here on Austin 316 Day. As I record this, Stone Cold is supposed to be on Raw tonight. As far as I know, he will be on the show. You very well may be listening to this after the fact, but with Raw emanating from the PC, I'm not sure if that's still set in stone, but it's going to be weird to see him celebrating 316 Day with absolutely no one in the arena. You know, I don't know who he's going to be drinking beer with or whatever, but I'm looking forward to that. But it was very fitting. They dropped this episode today on the WWE Network. It was available at 10 a.m. Eastern time on the network, so I guess that's a new thing going forward. That's the new, not rule, but like that's the new thing they're doing going forward, that any new content that goes up on the network, premiering after Raw or after a pay-per-view or whatever on a certain day, it goes up at 10 a.m., which I like a lot because it allows me to watch it beforehand and not wait until after Raw, which I usually don't do anyway. But this was well worth the watch. I've been looking forward to this for a while now. They've been promoting this, or at least teasing it, since I think back in January. In the last couple episodes of Broken Skull Sessions with Taker, Kane, Goldberg, Big Show were all very good. Obviously all Attitude Era stars. Bret Hart was no exception. But he's a bit different than Goldberg and the other ones they've had on before. Taker, I think, was still the most must-see the most must-see episode they've had yet for obvious reasons. But this episode was still very, very good. But I should warn you from the get-go, though, there was a lot of talk about the Montreal Screwjob, which, I mean, obviously I expected, I figured that, but we've heard so fucking much about the Montreal Screwjob over the past 23 years or whatever it is, that I'm not really surprised that they got into it here. I'm not surprised, but it is disappointing just because we've heard so much about it. They've literally hammered out every fucking detail about the Montreal Screwjob that I really wish they would have gone into detail about other periods of his career. And they did touch upon WCW, and obviously they're going to talk about the Austin Hart match, that iconic WrestleMania 13 submission match. And some other stuff too. Goldberg ending his career very briefly at the very end of this episode, at the very tail end of the show. But still, other than that, though, I thought this was great. Clock's in at around an hour and 8 minutes, and there's a lot to get into here, so let's get started. So Austin, first of all, asks him how he's doing, how it is up in Calgary, Canada, whatever. He said it's very cold up there currently. Again, I think this was recorded back in January, so I'm not sure if that's changed at all. But they talk about how they've always gotten along, and how, they kind of established their history, and they kind of recall stories of when they first met back in the late 90s. This I did not know. I'm not sure if this has ever been documented before, but Bret Hart talked about here about how he had heard about Stone Cold Steve Austin from WCW, from his tag team with Brian Pillman. And when he heard about Austin getting fired from WCW, he asked, I don't know if it was Vince or some other higher up at WWE, he had asked them, do you know, have you thought about hiring his name wasn't Stone Cold at that point, but have you thought about hiring Steve Austin? He'd be a really good hand. He'd be perfect here for WWE. And then as Bret puts it, Stone Cold, Steve Austin was hired the very next week. So again, I'm not sure how truthful that is because I've never heard that before. But if so, I think Bret Hart might be the one to thank for Stone Cold arriving in WWE when he did back in 1996. But anyway, so Bret Hart immediately gets right into the Montreal Screwjob here. That's the first thing that Austin brings up. I'm not surprised, but again, I really wish they would have started with, maybe the beginning of his career and his time on top as the WWE champion, maybe the first match with Shawn, or, I don't know, the Roddy Piper match, or the British Bulldog match, all of which is mentioned here on this show. But the Montreal Screwjob this episode consists a lot of the talk about the Montreal Screwjob. It takes up a majority of the episode, which is, again, expected, but I'm not really a big fan of that. I literally just watched an episode of Dark Side of the Ring from last year. I know I'm a little late to the party on this, but a lot of the stuff he talked about on that episode, he regurgitated here. He repeated that same information, so it really was nothing new. If you know anything about the Montreal Screwjob, this really wasn't all that enlightening. But nonetheless, he gets into how WWE wasn't going to honor the contract that Vince had offered him for like $1 million a year for 20 years, which is fucking ridiculous. You would never see a contract like that in 2020, where the $1 million I kind of get. Obviously, it wouldn't be over the course of 20 years because that makes no sense. He would be making absolutely nothing. But the 20-year deal thing sounds completely ridiculous. I've heard of 10-year deals and 5-year deals and 8-year deals, never a 20-year deal. So that might have been the first and last time they've ever offered something like that. But they couldn't honor it because the business wasn't really doing all too well at that point, and they couldn't pay him what they had promised for the $1 million a year for the next 20 years. So what ended up happening was, which I didn't know, Vince had actually offered Bret to help him negotiate a deal with WCW, which is really weird. I mean, you would never see that today. That's like Vince saying, hey, John Cena, I can't pay you what we're planning to pay you for the next 20 years. We're going to have to let you go. Not just to let him go, but, it just makes more sense financially for you to go to AEW. So what we're going to do, I'm going to sit down with Tony Khan, and I'm going to negotiate a deal for you to go work for AEW. First of all, you would never hear about something like that today. Second of all, that just sounds so fucking bizarre. For Vince to sit down with WCW, for him to work with Eric Bischoff, for him to get the best deal possible with them, unless he was working both promotions, which was never going to happen. That just seems weird to me. And Bret Hart talked about how he was very close with Vince, and his lawyer, Bret's lawyer that is, actually advised him against doing that, as he should have, because that makes absolutely no sense. His lawyer was like, I wouldn't have Vince negotiate the deal. That sounds very fishy. That's very odd. So anyway, Bret Hart found out about facing Shawn Michaels in Montreal for the WWE Championship, because Bret was the champion at the time, at Survivor Series in 1997 at like a live event in San Jose, California, or some shit like that. They had an issue a few months earlier where like they beat each other up in the locker room, which was detailed in that episode of Dark Side of the Ring that I mentioned earlier from last year. Bret Hart said he told Shawn flat out, listen, I'm fine putting you over on my way out. I'll let you, I'll drop the championship to you. I have no issue doing that whatsoever. Shawn Michaels said in response, I respect that, I appreciate that, but I would not do the same for you. And again, he talked all about this in Dark Side of the Ring. I'm sure he's telling the truth, but that sounds absolutely bizarre. So that was the moment where Bret Hart realized, and again, I have nothing to back this up that it's not true. It just sounds very fishy for Bret Hart to say, oh, I don't have any problem putting you over, despite the fact that they had had issues for years by that point. Prior to that point, they had issues for a long time. So for him to say, oh, I'm willing to put you over, but it was this one incident, even after they beat each other up backstage, Bret Hart was still willing to put him over. But all it took was Shawn saying, I wouldn't do the same for you, that convinced Bret to not put him over. I mean, it just sounds really weird to me. But anyway, that was the point where Bret said, again, like I said, that he wouldn't put him over. Vince told Bret that he could leave however he wanted, whenever he wanted, because they couldn't come to terms on a deal. And he had creative control in the last 60 days of his contract, which was interesting because you would never see that today. Because they were so close, I guess Vince wanted to really allow him to go out on his terms the way that he wanted to, just to ensure that he wasn't made to look like a fool on his way out. And they told Vince flat out the very next day when they were at Raw or something like that, listen, I'm not going to drop the belt to Shawn. And Stone Cold brings up how he kind of related it to his own situation back in 2002 when Vince, or not Vince specifically, but Creative had told Stone Cold, we want to have you lose to Brock Lesnar in a King of the Ring qualifier. And Austin was like, I ain't doing that shit. He called out, quit the company, and he wasn't seen for another year. So he kind of gets where Bret is coming from. But for Bret, it wasn't the fact that it was a dumb booking decision, which is what pissed Austin off in his case against Brock, and that's why he left. With Bret Hart, it was more a matter of honor. It was more an honor thing for Bret. And he told Vince that the next day. So Vince was like, okay, we'll bring in Shawn to discuss blah, blah, blah. So they were going to have like this three-way conversation where Vince, Bret would tell Vince right in front of Shawn, I don't want to drop the belt to Shawn Michaels. As soon as they hold that meeting, Vince starts off the meeting by saying, we're putting the belt on Shawn Michaels. And Bret's like, I didn't agree to that. Where did that come from? So Bret, I guess at that point, did not see Shawn again until Montreal, until Survivor Series. He told Vince, I don't want to go. I don't want to go to WCW. I love WWE. Kind of looks up to Vince as a fatherly figure, like I said earlier. They're very, very close. He loved working for WWE. He didn't want to go anywhere. But so what he did was he asked Vince, he asked him, what are your plans for me? If I stay, what are you going to do with me for the next year? And Vince flat out told him, I'm going to have you do jobs to Shawn Michaels. I'm going to have you lose to Shawn Michaels at every possible turn until you leave. Again, another thing that doesn't make any sense to me. If they're going to keep Bret Hart, they're going to have him lose to Shawn Michaels at every turn. Not only would they not do that, why the fuck would Vince McMahon tell him that? Why would he tell him, I'm going to have you lose to Shawn Michaels at every turn until you leave? That makes absolutely no sense. So again, I'm not saying Bret Hart is lying. It just sounds really, really fishy. So I thought that was bizarre. Anyway, if that is true, what a weird thing for Vince to say. Because if he really wanted to convince Bret to stay, why the fuck would he say, I'm going to have you lose over the next year? That's not something you outright say. That's just something you do. Vince does not tell people, I'm going to bury you until you leave. They just bury you until you leave. They don't outright tell you that. I thought that was really weird. But anyway, so that was a sign for Bret that he knew that he needed to leave at that point. So he signed with WCW, and it was sad for him because he didn't want to leave. And he was called by Vince right beforehand, and Bret's mindset on the whole thing was that he felt that Vince McMahon felt that he needed to choose between Bret and Shawn Michaels. He couldn't have both. So what ended up happening was that he never refused to do a job before. He had never refused to lose to anyone, Bret Hart did, before this whole incident happened. And he felt that Shawn was the person that Vince wanted to go with. He was younger, and he was the guy that he wanted to go with. And Bret, they couldn't pay him what they, were expecting to pay him. So Shawn was the guy to go with, and he was the fresher face at that point. And Bret had even said to Vince, listen, I'll drop the belt to Steve Austin, who was, they had worked together before at WrestleMania 13, which they get into later. It's, Survivor Series 1996. They had worked together a ton of times. Bret's idea was for him to drop the belt to Stone Cold Steve Austin, which would have made Stone Cold, but it also would have prevented that great moment of Steve Austin beating Shawn Michaels for the belt at WrestleMania 14. And he also even said, listen, I'll drop the belt to Shawn Michaels, not in Montreal, though. I'll do it the next night on Raw. And Steve Austin, I'm really glad he brought this up, because my mindset is, what the fuck, you didn't want to drop the belt to him here at Survivor Series, but you'll do it the next night on Raw? How much sense does that make? And I guess Bret Hart explained, he goes, well, it was more a matter of honor, because it wasn't in my hometown, so they'll have me win, but I'll lose it. I mean, it was a really weird thing. The weird thing for me, and again, I love Bret Hart, and they definitely did fuck him over by doing what they did. My thing on this, my opinion on the whole thing, first of all, it wasn't a work like Scott Hall thought it was on that the dark side of the dark side of the ring thing. He had said at the end of the documentary, he thought it was all an elaborate, work and elaborate, everyone was in on it. Get the fuck out of here with that bullshit. But anyway, what was I even saying? Oh, the never refusing to do the job thing, or blah blah blah. Or I guess so. In refusing to do the job at Survivor Series, he would go over in his hometown. Next night, he would drop it to Shawn. My opinion on the whole thing was that both sides were in the wrong. Bret didn't have respect for Shawn. It didn't fucking matter, though. Yeah, he had creative control in the final few days of it, or the final few months of his WWE contract, but it's not his company, though. It's Vince's company. The guy can do whatever he wants. It's not like they're having him go out there and kiss Shawn's ass and fucking humiliating him on the way out. They were just having him lose to Shawn, which at that point made the most sense. Yeah, you could have Bret go over in his hometown, blah, 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 and it would be a great moment, but it's not about making Bret Hart look great. The guy's not going to be here anymore. So I totally get where Vince was coming from in having Shawn go over in Montreal. Bret Hart wanted nothing to do with it, though. That was the problem. So anyway, Vince talked about how he wanted to make it, or Bret Hart talked about, not Vince rather, he wanted to make it the best match possible. And going out there, they re-watched the match here on the podcast, or on the interview, whatever. And he thought going out there, okay, he's going to screw me, but it's probably going to be a count out or a DQ, because he had asked Earl, and I'm kind of getting that from the dark side of the ring thing, that he said to Earl, listen, they're going to try to screw me. I'm getting the feeling they're going to try to take the title off of me without having me get pinned or submitted or whatever. I feel like they're going to count out or DQ me. Which I think the plan was initially to do some sort of no contest, which they were doing that shit even 20 years ago. To end a pay-per-view in a no contest is fucking lame, especially 20 years ago when people are paying $50 for this shit, only to have him drop it the next night. That's just fucking dumb. I'm sorry, that's stupid. But that's, I guess, what the original plan was. So anyway, Bret saw Earl Hebner the night before. They were really close. And he told Earl, listen, I feel like they're going to try to screw me. Please do not screw me. And Earl said, listen, I swear on my kids, I will not screw you out of the WWE title. I'm going to make sure this thing goes according to plan, blah, blah, blah. He got really emotional, I guess, did Earl Hebner. And Bret found out, he was like, his mindset was, if they have anyone else referee this match, then I'm probably getting screwed. But if it's Earl, then I'm good, because I respect Earl, I trust Earl, I respect him to not, I trust him to not screw me. And he also believes that Pat Patterson wasn't involved, but it was Pat's idea, I guess, to do the reverse sharpshooter spot, where Shawn would get the, sharpshooter locked in on Bret, and then Bret would reverse that into a sharpshooter of his own. So kind of a cool spot. They always made it look good, whatever. And Bret even admits his mistake was letting anyone get a hold on the guy. So in his mind, once anyone locked a submission on him, that was where they were going to screw him, and that's exactly what happened. And Bret Hart even said, listen, I don't blame Earl Hebner at all. If I was in his position, I would probably do the exact same thing, which I was shocked that he even said that, but he's right. I mean, Earl Hebner should not be blamed. The guy was just doing his job. I mean, they shouldn't have done what they did, but it's not like he came up with the idea. He's just following orders, because if he didn't follow orders and he didn't, as he said in the Dark Side of the Ring special, because obviously this is all Bret and Austin here, in the Dark Side of the Ring special, we hear from Bruce Pritchard and Bischoff and Hebner and a few other people involved. Not Vince, not Shawn, unfortunately, but we do hear from Bret. Earl talked about there that if I didn't ring the bell, Vince would have rang the bell himself. And I probably would have gotten fired anyway, so it didn't even matter. But anyway, so Bret thinks from the first moment that he got screwed and the bell rings and Shawn wins the title, the first thing that went through his head was that he was thinking, you piece of shit. Talking about Vince McMahon. Taker was pissed backstage. He knocked over a fucking garbage can. He wanted to find out what happened. Shawn was crying in the corner, according to Bret, in the locker room, which I kind of find hard to believe, but that's what he said. So he talked here, and again, he got into it in a lot more detail in the Dark Side of the Ring special, but he mentioned here how he went to go take a shower. He was naked when he walked past Vince from getting out of the shower, which was weird. He talked about here how about he was going to, rewind, he was going to go up to Vince naked and beat the shit out of the guy or punch him, whatever. Why he would do that, I don't know. The guy was going to let his emotions get the best of him. It would have been weird. He said even here, he even said as much here that if I go up to the guy and punch him while I'm naked, that's going to be a real weird scene to recreate when we make the movie out of this thing. Because that is kind of fucking weird. I know how pissed he is at Vince. Why would you punch the guy when you're naked? That's just weird to me. Anyway, though, so what he ended up doing, he told Vince, listen, when I get changed and I get ready and whatever, and you're still fucking here, and he didn't have a shirt on, I guess, and you're still here when I'm done getting changed, I'm going to knock the shit out of you. I'm going to punch you. So what ended up happening after that, well, Vince tried to convince him beforehand. He said, oh, that's the first time I've ever lied to anyone, blah, 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 and Bret's thinking bullshit, which is, completely accurate. Vince was definitely lying when he said that. That's a whole bunch of bullshit. So Vince's mindset, according to Bret, at least in his mind, was that Vince wanted to stand up to Bret in front of the entire locker room and kind of make an example out of Bret Hart. And Bret even said, listen, if you're still here when I'm done getting changed, I'm going to knock you out. And he got finished changing, and in his mind he's thinking, wow, I'm going to actually punch Vince McMahon. So he goes up to Vince, they charge each other, they kind of walk up to each other, and they immediately lock up like it's a fucking wrestling match. I guess that was their first, reaction. That was their gut instinct, was to lock up like it was a wrestling match. Whatever. They had done the same thing on TV a couple months before that, like earlier on in 97. And when they did it on TV, Vince actually maneuvered his arms in a certain way, and Bret's shirt was like over his head or something, but they maneuvered it in a certain way where Vince did rather, where Bret couldn't punch him because his arm was stuck. And he was worried that he was going to do the same thing here. So when he got him locked up, he tried to avoid that hold that Vince got him in the first time, and he hit him with an uppercut right in the fucking jaw. He broke a bone in his hand, he said, and he knocked him out cold. And the documentary crew that was there for the Wrestling in the Shadows documentary that they were filming on Bret at the time, he kicked him out beforehand, but he's thinking to himself, I hope they catch some of this, because this is going to be great. He sees Shawn, whose face was in his hands. He's crying, blah, 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 like a fucking idiot. If that's even true. I'm sure part of that is true. The fact that he was crying, I don't really believe that, but whatever. Bret's walking out, and he thanks Shawn Michaels for the match. Really weird. I'm thinking, okay, maybe he's being sarcastic. Why would he do that? And he even said here, he didn't mention this in the Dark Side of the Ring special, but he said here that he realized he should have hurt him. He should have just kicked him square in the face. So they had a momentary truce there, a momentary, kind of a temporary moment of truce. And he realized the next night when Michaels went out on Raw and buried him in a promo, that momentary truce was over between them. So that wasn't really a great feeling for him. So he talks about his relationship with Vince now and how it's a good relationship. They get along now, whatever. He won't ever fully get over the fact that he was screwed that night in Montreal at Survivor Series. But he does partly forgive him for the fact that, Vince gave him his entire career, gave him a lot of opportunities, and, gave him a lot of awesome memories before that whole thing happened. And he even said, I think Stone Cold actually brought this up, that Bret Hart was the first one to lay hands on anyone, was the first person out of anyone to lay hands on Vince McMahon on an episode of Raw in March of 1997. I had never known that. I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense. That was pre-Mr. McMahon. That was pre the on-air character at that time, which they kind of talk about here, too. That was the same night that Bret Hart went off and he turned heel, kind of, and he planted the seeds for a heel turn when he went off on the audience, and he was like, I don't give a goddamn, whatever. He was saying goddamn a lot. And they had actually told him to go out and do that. He was told to just go off, rant about Vince McMahon, and he was told initially that only the house would hear that, which means only the people in the audience would hear it. It would be bleeped out on TV. It wouldn't be shown on TV, whatever. And he found out afterwards they were all pissed at him, like, oh, why would you say goddamn? Why would you say that? And then he was like, you told me to say that. And they were like, oh, okay, we forgot, which is weird. But anyway, Stone Cold asks Bret Hart, did you realize in that moment, when that whole thing happened on that episode of Raw, well before the Montreal Screwjob, that when you did that, you guys were single-handedly creating the Vince McMahon character, the Mr. McMahon character? And of course, Bret Hart says no. I mean, that's not really something you could do that you can force. It was all organic, which is why it worked. And people still say to this day, which I absolutely agree with, that the greatest heel in WWE history was Mr. McMahon. As odd as that is to say, if you go back and watch the work that he was doing at that point in the Attitude Era and how he came across and how fucking detestable of a person, of a human being that he was, it's true. So anyway, before he signed to WCW, he was told by Kevin Nash, maybe not Nash, but a few other people, to not go to WCW because it was a fucking shit show over there. And he even says here, he said they were the stupidest people to ever run a wrestling company. That's some strong words right there. No one has as much disdain for WCW as Bret Hart does. He talks about, well, the first thing you got to do when they bring me into WCW is to work with Hulk Hogan. How can you not? How is that in a match you not do from the get-go? They didn't do that. He wanted to work with Booker T. I don't think he ever did. He even said Eric Bischoff didn't know shit. He called it disorganized. He called it chaos. And sometimes they would fly him in first class, give him a nice hotel, ride him in this nice car to the arena for nothing. He wouldn't even be used on TV. That makes absolutely no sense. And he said it got hard. It got really, hard to care. It came to a certain point where I could not give two shits. So anyway, kind of transitioning out of that, he said he had a good grasp on the business from day one. And, his whole family is a bunch of wrestlers. So it's not really hard to imagine that he had a good grasp on what wrestling was and what it meant and stuff like that from the first day he broke into the business years earlier. And Austin even asks him, why did you work as a babyface? This was at a time where before being a heel was the cool thing, blah, blah, blah. Why did you work as Jim Ross would say, the typical white meat babyface? And he said, I was the right formula at the right time. It was exactly what people were looking for. I wasn't Hulk Hogan. I wasn't this jacked up 6-foot monster whatever guy. I wasn't this giant wrestler. I was just a really, really good wrestler for the size that I was. I could talk. I can believably be bought into as a threat to anyone I stepped in the ring with. And he always made it a thing. He was always adamant about making his matches look as real as possible. And he even said the best wrestlers were wrestling fans first, which I think in a lot of cases is true. He discusses the classic matches that he had with Roddy Piper, with British Bulldog, with didn't really mention the Owen matches, which were really, that was disappointing. Maybe they talked about it and they cut it, I don't know. I really wish, if I only had one regret from this episode of Broken Skull Sessions, was that they discussed that feud. I mean, I'm sure he's discussed it elsewhere, but he's also discussed the Montreal Screwjob elsewhere too, and we heard all about that here. So it would have been cool if they got into the Owen Hart stuff from 1994, 93, their subsequent feud and the awesome matches they had at that point, because those were some of the best matches Bret ever had. And he had a lot of awesome matches, but some of the best matches he had in his entire career, were with his brother Owen Hart. Anyway, his whole intent was to give Vince a library of classic matches. And that's when they transitioned into the Stone Cold Steve Austin feud from 96 and 97. He knew as soon as he saw Stone Cold that he could do some great stuff with him. And Austin talked about loving his selling and all this other stuff. They rewatched their first match. Before they get into the WrestleMania 13 match, they actually rewatched the match that a lot of people tend to forget about from Survivor Series 1996. Before they had that submission match at WrestleMania, they had a first match. I think it might have been Bret Hart's first match back. After taking time off from losing to Shawn at WrestleMania 12, he came back to feud with Stone Cold, who I guess was talking shit about him in his absence. They had that first match at Survivor Series, which was also really, really good. The WrestleMania match is better, but that Survivor Series match was also excellent. They rewatch it, they talk about it. Bret Hart was gas coming out of it, which means that he blew up real quickly, and that means that he wasn't physically ready. He kind of underestimated the athlete that Austin was at that point. And anyway, so he talked about how he would give it 4 stars. That's how good of a match it was. And they also transitioned into how Vince wanted to turn Bret Hart heel in the United States, but keep him babyface for foreign countries, because that's where he really did well in merchandise and stuff like that. Bret Hart didn't want to turn heel because he was the highest, according to him, the highest seller of merchandise in the entire WWE. And CM Punk has talked about this before too. I mean, being a heel creatively is more fun because there's a lot more things you can do that being a babyface doesn't really allow you to do. But the issue there is that you make a lot more of your money as a babyface in terms of merchandise, and his royalty checks were always really, really big. So why throw that away for whatever reason? So anyway, he met with Vince before he was supposed to turn heel, and Vince gave him a list of people that he could work with as a heel and a list of people he could work with as a babyface. And one of the people that he could work with was Shawn. And one of the reasons why Shawn and Bret never really got along was that at this point, when Bret was about to turn heel, Shawn was a babyface. And in being the top 2 babyfaces in the company, everyone wants that number 1 spot. So now Shawn can have that spot all to himself, and then Bret can be the number 1 heel. They would not have had any issues in that respect. If Shawn had stayed heel, or rather a babyface, and Bret stayed heel, then they would be on opposite sides of the spectrum, and it wouldn't even really matter. He also talked about Vader and how I guess Bret Hart got hurt by him. Vader always hurt him every time they worked, and they don't bury Vader. I mean, the guy's dead now, so why talk shit about the dead? But they talk about how Vader was an option if he was a heel, because I guess Vader was a good guy at that point. So Stone Cold Steve Austin was one of the people that he could work with, but the only way they would make it happen was if it was a double turn, because Stone Cold going into that WrestleMania match, which you found out sooner, right before WrestleMania, that it would be a submission match that Bret Hart wasn't overly familiar with, and then I guess Austin too was kind of pissed about it being a submission match because he didn't even have a submission. I guess he had the $1 Million Dream that he adopted from Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, right before that. But other than that, the guy was not a submission wrestler. So neither of them were really, overly optimistic about the idea of them being, or of the match being a submission match. So Bret Hart heard about the rematch, and he was intrigued about the possibility of working with Austin again. The issue was that he saw their rematch happening from Survivor Series at SummerSlam, not at WrestleMania. That's only 3 or 4 months later. It was kind of abrupt. It was kind of too soon. Bret Hart didn't really think that it should be happening at WrestleMania. At the same time, Austin was the only one who knew of Bret Hart's heel turn before he went heel. He was the only one who knew about it because Vince had told him beforehand, hey, we're going to go with the double turn here, where you want to make you a babyface. People are kind of getting behind you, and we're going to turn Bret Hart heel. And the only people who knew about that, I guess aside from a few elite others, was Vince McMahon and Bret Hart, obviously, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. So anyway, They had a no busted open policy that time, which means, and I'm not talking about the radio show, but rather they couldn't bleed. There was a no blood policy. This was back, this was early 97, so they may have been still PG at this point. I don't think so. But Bret Hart was like, listen, the only way this match is going to work, if you, Austin, get busted open, you got to bleed. So they pieced together a pretty logical match. The only thing they got permission from the management to do in the match was to fight in the crowd. That was the only thing they could really do to make the match different. Because with it being a submission match, it was going to be tough to get the match over because you could do no false finishes. It's not like, 1, 2, and he kicked out at 2. You can't really do that with a submission match. So they were put in a precarious position right from the get-go with it being a submission match. And Bret Hart even said, I had a submission match at WrestleMania 20 with Bob Backlund, and I love Bob, but it was one of the worst matches I ever had. He called it the worst match of his entire career with Bob Backlund at WrestleMania 11. I don't know if I would go that far. I'm sure Bret has had some far worse matches than the one with Bob from WrestleMania 11. That show sucked. It was here in Connecticut, I think in Hartford actually, or New Haven, whatever. The show is absolutely terrible. The match wasn't that bad. I think Bret Hart has had far worse matches than the one with Bob. But the bottom line being, the fact is, the point of the matter is this, is that Bret Hart didn't really think that worked with Bob, that with it being an I quit submission match, whatever. So how is this going to be any better? So Bret Hart's mentality going into it was that he wanted to make it more like a school fight, if that makes any sense. More like, beating the shit out of each other as opposed to a real technical wrestling match. He wanted it to emulate any good UFC fight where it felt real, and it did. And they rewatched the match, and they talk about how Austin got a bit of both reactions coming out. He had some people cheering, but it was mostly a heel reaction because he was a heel going into the match. And Bret Hart's thought process going out to the ring that night was that he didn't think the match would be as great as he wanted it to be. Because it's a submission match, so it would probably be better if it wasn't, if it was a normal standard singles match. So anyway, like I said, they rewatched the WrestleMania 13 match. Austin talks about selling the knee, because I guess he had real, legitimate knee surgery prior to that point. So in selling the knee, it felt real. They discussed the low blow and how he executed that and how it looked real, and Jim Ross's call of it was like something Saskatoon or whatever. This is really interesting. So when Bret Hart had Stone Cold in the sharpshooter, Austin brings up how they didn't know how long that spot would last. Bret Hart was going to have Austin in the sharpshooter, and the big appeal of that one spot was that Austin was in that move for a long time before the match ended, and he never tapped either. The referee called for the bell, I think, unless I'm misremembering it, I'm not remembering it the right way, but I'm pretty sure he just tapped, or he just passed out. He never tapped out, which makes no sense with it being a submission match. But I guess, whatever, that's just the rules in the match. So that was something they never discussed going in. They kind of something that they decided on the fly. And as Bret Hart walked out, he talks about how when he took the chair to Austin's injured knee, the crowd was still cheering him despite the fact it was a heel mannerism. So he had a different attitude walking out. He acted heelish, and that was the perfect example of what a double turn should be. With Bret Hart acting like a total asshole, and Stone Cold was such a great, sympathetic babyface. It just worked. It was a great dynamic. And Austin even said here, too, another really interesting tidbit about the match, was that he called an audible, which means that he decided after the fact. It wasn't something that was planned. It was something that was decided on the spot, that he can't just go out looking all bloody and looking like an idiot. He can't just go out, without stunning someone. So he stunned Mike Chioda, the referee, but he got over with the loss. He didn't win. He never beat Bret Hart that night. He didn't beat Bret Hart at Survivor Series either. I don't think he ever beat Bret Hart. He brought that up here. But he got over in losing. Bret Hart said the exact same thing happened when he himself faced the British Bulldog for the Intercontinental Championship at SummerSlam 1992. Bulldog, the whole idea was to get Bulldog over. And it was a big moment. They were in England, and he got over, and with the title and whatnot. But people don't really remember Bulldog's IC title run, because it was Bret Hart who got over in defeat there. He was the one who got over in losing. And that was another classic example of that. And Stone Cold felt like walking out that night, or, leaving the arena that night, that they accomplished the task at hand. Bret Hart even said it was the perfect transition, and I absolutely agree. He called it an easy match, that they loved working together, and that they, again, bring up that Stone Cold Steve Austin never beat Bret Hart, which is absolutely true. They did have a pay-per-view match the following month at like In Your House something, like 14, 16, whatever it was. Revenge of the Taker, I think the name of the show is called. And I think Stone Cold won on that show. He beat Bret Hart by DQ, but he never pinned him though, so that's a little different. So to close out the episode, they rewatch Stone Cold versus Owen Hart from SummerSlam 96, I think it was. Yeah, I think it was SummerSlam 96. He thought that was the end of his career, taking the pile driver from Owen. I mean, it was an accident, but in taking that pile driver, he couldn't feel his fingertips. He thought his neck did break, but he thought that was it. He thought his career was over. But that match, though, because of that injury, that was what caused him to become Stone Cold Steve Austin. But because, he wasn't really a technical wrestler anymore, he kind of had to resort to a more brawling style. And because of that, he got over big. So not to say that the injury was a blessing in disguise, because no one should ever have their neck broken, but he turned that negative into a positive. And they share Owen Hart memories, and they discuss Canadian Stampede, that awesome, awesome, awesome In Your House pay-per-view. And I don't ordinarily say this about shows that I wasn't a fan for, like shows that I wasn't around for, but that show is one of my favorite pay-per-views I've ever seen. It's from 1997. I'm not a big fan of the Attitude Era shows, but I thought this one specific show was fucking great from the summer of 1997. It was such a great pay-per-view. And that's when Owen Hart actually pinned him for the win. He pinned Stone Cold in that main event, that awesome 10-man, I think it was a 10-man tag team match main event. He pinned Austin for the victory that night. Bret Hart said that he didn't want to let Vince, despite the Montreal Screwjob, ruin all of his great memories that he had in WWE and throughout his career, despite the fact that their relationship ended on bad terms back in 97. And it meant a lot to him that night, not that specific night of the Screwjob, but rather on Canadian Stampede, that he had the respect of the wrestlers that night, and for many of his other matches from that point forward and prior to that point, he likes to cherish those memories. And he says, above all else, that he takes 90s wrestling over any other period in wrestling history. He thought the 90s had the best possible era for wrestling, which can be easily debated, but he's not wrong in the sense where they had Bret Hart, they had Shawn Michaels, they had Piper, Bulldog, Owen Hart, and so many others that made that time period so special was the 90s. Maybe not exactly so towards the end of the decade, but definitely in the middle there with Hart and Michaels. It was one of the best periods they've ever had. And Ric Flair there towards the beginning. So Austin asked him to end the episode, what do you want to be remembered as? And he said one thing and one thing only, to be remembered as the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be. Obviously requoting his catchphrase, his signature catchphrase. He's also very proud of how he never injured anybody throughout his entire career, which is why he takes exception to Seth Rollins, when Rollins essentially ended the career of Sting a couple of years ago in an accident, when he paralyzed Sting. Not paralyzed him, but pretty much broke his neck and ended his career. And Bret Hart fucking raked him over the coals for that one. I don't know if they've gotten over that now, or if they're friends, whatever, if they've made up, but Bret Hart was not nice towards Seth Rollins for injuring Sting that night, and he called him reckless. I mean, shit happens. I mean, accidents happen. It happens with everyone. But he actually goes on the record here. I'm surprised they kept this in, because the guy's the current Universal Champion. But he called Goldberg the most unprofessional person he has ever been in the ring with. And I know Goldberg, he did end Bret Hart's career. It was an accident, and obviously there was no ill intent there. But it was that one bad kick in that match from WCW. And he said here that he actually told Bill Goldberg beforehand to not hurt him, and he did anyway. Obviously by accident, but he fucked him up real bad that he didn't really wrestle after that. He's had a couple matches, quote-unquote, since then, but that was really what marked the end of his career. So I was surprised at the burial of Goldberg. First of all, I thought they got over it by now. I guess not, because he says that Goldberg does not belong in the Hall of Fame with the reputation that he had back in the late 90s. I was really surprised that they kept this in, because the guy is still currently with the company, Goldberg is. So I was surprised they kept this burial of Goldberg in the feed here for the episode. But that's how they closed it out. Stone Cold thanks him for all the memories and putting him over and their feud and matches and guidance and whatever else. And they show a quick flashback to some house show match they had back in 96 where Stone Cold tried to pop him. He tried to make him laugh and doing like a chicken wing or whatever. And Bret Hart never really corpsed in the ring. No one was ever really able to make Bret Hart laugh. But Austin came close in that house show match in '96, and that's how they ride off into the sunset. They say that they never really shared a beer in the ring together, but they do right here at the end of the Broken Skull Sessions episode with Bret Hart. So I thought this was great. Again, a lot of talk about the Montreal Screwjob, which a lot of shit you probably already knew if you saw Dark Side of the Ring, if you saw Wrestling with Shadows, if you've really read any interview with Bret Hart or read his book or whatever over the last 2 decades. You know all about the Montreal Screwjob. This is nothing new. I thought it was interesting, don't get me wrong. But, I mean, we've heard about it so often now for so long that I'm, like, so sick about hearing about this dumb shit with the Montreal Screwjob. And, again, it's important. But to spend a half an hour on it out of an hour and 8-minute episode, I thought was a little excessive. Other than that, though, this was great. Never will complain about hearing from Bret Hart. The guy's a legend. The Stone Cold match, you had to talk about it. I mean, WrestleMania's coming up. Maybe if it doesn't get postponed, it probably will. It has to at this point. But they relived that match. They rewatched it, broke it down. Really, really good stuff. So, again, check this out on the WWE Network. Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Bret Hart, available right now on the WWE Network. And thank you guys for checking out the episode review. I appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more content. We'll be back with another new networking show probably over the weekend. I don't think there's any new network content until this coming weekend. Ms. and Mrs. is done till the summer. Toto Bellas doesn't come back for another couple weeks unless they move the premiere date of season 5 a couple months, but I don't think I don't think the whole coronavirus thing will affect that, unfortunately. But that should be up in a couple weeks. And I think there's a new episode of Untold, WWE Untold on Sunday, covering, what's his name? Not Mark Cuban. Dennis Rodman and his whole stint, I think, in WCW, which is really fucking random, but hey, it sounds interesting. So that should be up on Sunday. My review of that should be up soon after that same day. So with that being said, guys, have a great rest of your week. Enjoy Austin 316 Day, swig a soda of the working man, and in the words of Stone Cold Steve Austin himself, I'll catch your ass down the road.